This is the Past Lives podcast, and I'm your host, Simon Bown. So this week, I'm talking to Mark Beale. Mark first practiced hypnosis with his family in New Zealand at age 10. And at 25, Mark took a year-long trip to India to motorcycle and study yoga and Tibetan Buddhism. A series of awakening experiences followed in the next few years. These featured past life regressions, including recalling being a priest in a sleep temple in Egypt, where he was essentially practicing past life regression 4,500 years ago. Mark was put on the spiritual path fully at 26 due to his girlfriend's spiritual awakening crisis that involved him deeply and required spiritual releasement. He integrated his experiences by reading Brian Weiss, studying meditation, Kundalini yoga, and the superconscious while travelling especially in India, Bali, Nepal and Sri Lanka. By 2006 he completed studies in hypnotherapy and past life regression in India and became a full-time professional and has been based in Asia ever since. Hi Mark, thanks a lot for coming onto the podcast. It's kind of you to give us your time.
Hi Simon, thanks for inviting me.
Well, I was a student with you at the Past Life Awakening Institute, and you have such a fantastic course, and it was so enlightening. Even though I've got so much knowledge from the past and done past life regressions before, it's been fantastic. But how did you start out? How did you get into hypnosis?
Oh, that's great to hear. Thanks a lot, Simon. I started out, maybe I'll just start with where I'm at now. So I'd sort of call myself a spiritual regression therapist. And by that, I mean 5 intertwined modalities. So you've got hypnosis and hypnotherapy, which is this life regression, past life regression, between lives, and then spirit releasement. So I do offer those as sessions and training. And for me, like the people that I work with these certification training courses, I'll find about half of them are psychologists or hypnotherapists or coaches, and they want to learn some of the more spiritual aspects, and half of them are spiritual healers or psychics who want to learn some of the more therapeutic tools and the structure and the process. So I guess for half your audience, it's going to be similar, where past life regressions is a bit of a stretch from the hypnotherapy that they know. And for other half of the audience, past lives are quite obvious and it fits with their religious beliefs. And they've also had a lot of sort of out there experiences that are in between lives or spirit releasement. So the way that I got into it was pretty much reflected in these 5 branches of what spiritual regression is. So I grew up in New Zealand, but I'm now in Asia and I've been here for 20 years. So I had 5 years in India, 10 years in Thailand, and quite a bit of travel. So that means I've lived most of my adult years in countries and communities where there's an inherent belief in and understanding of reincarnation and past lives. That certainly wasn't the case growing up in New Zealand as a child. So in my youth, I wasn't really fascinated with spirituality type, but I was always interested in wisdom, traditions, and consciousness. So in the name of group psychology and having an interesting career, I got an economics degree and worked in financial markets, which shows you I wasn't that spiritual type. I was kind of a suit for a while, but I pretty quickly realized that wasn't my life path. So I went on some long travels, and at 25, I made it to northern India, where I did a 10-day meditation retreat. So I sat in meditation, and I found that I clicked with it right away. I felt that meditative state felt really familiar. And in meditation, I spontaneously recalled being 10 years old back in New Zealand. I had memories of reading a book on hypnosis and then putting it into practice on my mother and sister. And I remember reading the book and having them recline and relax and afterwards say, oh, that was interesting. And I think I had hypnosis. But as I had that memory as a 25-year-old, I thought, where is this thought coming from? Is this real? And I had to verify it with my family. And they told me, yes, we remember that. That actually happened. So I thought as a 25-year-old, I didn't really have much interest in healing or spirituality or a background in it, but I did remember in a spontaneous hypnotic regression being 10 doing hypnosis. So that's sort of where I first got into it in the first step. So that was my first connection with hypnosis. Then on that same meditation retreat, it sort of became more like hypnotherapy. So once again, I went into a hypnotic state, but this time I recalled my parents' divorce when I was 16. Now, I hadn't forgotten that memory, but I had not acknowledged the pain of it. So I wasn't surprised when the memories of that time came up, but I was surprised about the strong emotions that came with it. I was also kind of surprised by the inner wisdom and that guided me through it and got me to a therapeutic resolution that was kind of like an inner child healing. And it was only years later, when I was 32, that I finally formally studied hypnotherapy, that I realized, oh, this hypnotherapy technique sounds familiar. It reminds me of what I did when I was 25, spontaneously in hypnosis. And I realized a few of my inner experiences matched very well with real therapeutic techniques. So once again, it clicked in again. And on that journey of meditation, I had a couple of intense years, like 98, 99. I spent a couple of years in India on that path. And I ended up going to about half a dozen 10-day meditation retreats. And eventually, I then spontaneously had past life recall in meditation. And again, this inner wisdom that would come up and give insights and resolutions. About this time, I also met the Dalai Lama and although it was just a brief handshake, was enough to make me feel the concept of an enlightened being on earth was feasible. And I was studying a lot of Tibetan Buddhism. So during that 2-year period, I came to quite easily accept that reincarnation and karma as concepts, and also as what felt experiences. There's still a part of me that thought, well, this could all be my own trip. So I hadn't really integrated it into my path of being a healer. I was thinking, well, what do I do with this now? But then I just kept on going with it. And then there was an experience that did happen that eventually became the one that meant I would join the healer's path fully.
You got loads of background and study and experience when it comes to these kind of spiritual aspects and this viewpoint and reincarnation. It's not like you've always, like you said, you were a suit and then you just studied it. You have got the experience yourself.
Yeah, it was through meditation. So for me, there's meditation and hypnosis. There are lots of different types of hypnosis and meditation. And some aspects of meditation and hypnosis are very different. But there are a lot of meditative techniques that are quite therapeutic and do have some areas of crossover. So I sort of did join the accessing my subconscious mind initially spontaneously through these explorations in meditation. And I found that just, as you keep going into it, you just end up peeling layer after layer. And so this ended up leading me to an experience that would ensure I would join the healer's path. So I'd been, a year and a half of fairly intense practice, building up these skills and getting comfortable with some of the underlying concepts, principles, philosophies behind it. But at this time, I met a girlfriend who had spent 5 years meditating pretty intensely in India. So she's a few steps down the path. And we were together one evening in Nepal. And just before we were about to go to sleep, suddenly she sat up in bed. The energy in the room totally shifted. And she began speaking in another voice about herself in the third person. And this voice said that it was the higher self of her. And that she, as a conscious personality, was in the distance and she couldn't hear us. But that we needed to talk together, her higher self and I, about her spiritual evolution. So, in past life regression, we often talk with a spirit guide or the higher self, and the person is still witnessing conscious awareness, even in hypnosis. This was a bit different, but we did speak about her past lives, our connection, and the spiritual path. So I was interacting with her when she was in a trance state, but I wasn't. And I was asking questions, eliciting information. So I was acting as if I was a spiritual regression therapist at the time, but I didn't know what one was then. And then in the morning, when I spoke with her, she had no memory of it. And I was noticing the contrast between her conscious self and the trance self that I'd met and interacted with that evening. So this went on for a number of nights over some weeks. And as I was trying to figure out what was happening, I went into a bookstore and for the first time found this book, Many Lives, Many Masters, so I read of Brian Weiss's clients spontaneously going into past lives and delivering information. So I'd read books on Buddhism, but I hadn't really read about therapy or past lives in that therapeutic sense. But reading this book made things start to make a lot of sense. So as the days went on, the wisdom speaking to or through her started to have some different voices. And then those voices started to become a little less wise. So as time went on, looking back on it, a key work to help make sense of what was happening became, for me, William J. Baldwin's book, which is Spirit Releasement Therapy, a Technical Manual. So part of what was happening here is I was having my own inner experiences, which I could dismiss as my trip, and how to integrate that into my life, and can I just sort of forget about it and just go back to how things were. But this gave me a compelling motivation to integrate those experiences and trying to really understand them and follow through with them in my life. So that's where I started to take it more seriously and got into the formal study and practice of past life regression.
Have you had your own powerful kind of spiritual experiences? Have you ever, gone into a trance and channeled someone or something like that?
Yeah, I've never been into the channeling or like that. But what I did do then was just formal past life regression sessions, sort of at this crossroads. So I ended up doing past life regression therapy for the first time after a number of spontaneous experiences. And so I had this crossroads, and I was, what do I do now after all of these experiences over these couple of years? Can I go back to a conventional life as a suit? Or do I have a spiritual life and be a monk? And that was a serious consideration. Or do I go and be a healer, whatever that means? So I was at this life crossroads, and I had these three kind of roads that I was feeling that I could walk down. And so then I did some past life regression, and I found 3 past lives that spoke to each of these and helped me make a decision. So the first life I recalled was being a wealthy Indian about the 1500s, and I had a lot of material comfort, but I did take it for granted a little bit. And I had in that life, I didn't have to work, I had access to education, and I remember having access to spiritual teachers. I recalled them coming around, and I recalled thinking, that's a good idea. I'll do some spiritual practice and training with these good spiritual teachers that I have access to. And then I progressed forward in my life, and I realized that I just enjoyed the material comfort, never really got round to it. And I was sort of like late 50s in that life, realizing I've left it a bit late. I always thought that I was going to do it, but I never followed through with it. And now it's a bit late. And I just left that session just feeling just a really quite heavy and sadness and regret for not having followed through. I think that's kind of spoke to the possibility of a comfortable conventional life in a suit. But since I'd had some of these spiritual experiences and seen some of the possibilities, if I were to not follow through with them, I didn't want to have that feeling again. So I had another life where, following on from that, where I recalled being a Tibetan monk in about the 1600s. And in that life, I was very earnest. I started early in that life. I studied, meditated, did a good job as a monk. And I remember the particular speciality was, within the community and the monastery, there were, you teach the Dharma to the people, but particularly with the adolescents, I was kind of like a mentor for them for some of the psychological things. When you're growing up as a young person, you can learn the Dharma, but then I was sort of a mentor and a coach to some of these young kids and the people in the community. And that's something I as part of my contribution. So I had been considering a monastic role in this life, but by remembering that I'd had a pretty complete and good monastic life in the past, I felt that I kind of satisfied that, and that talked to that earlier Indian life where I felt that I'd missed out, and so that sort of I saw that pattern and that I'd sort of closed it off, and I felt quite satisfied. So then there was one more life, which was I had this recall, and I was in an underground in a place that had a powerful energy. It was quite dark and dimly lit, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. And I realized that I was in ancient Egypt, and that I was with people and guiding people who were reclining, and I was sort of whispering and talking to them gently, taking them on a hypnotic spiritual journey. And I realized this is a sleep temple, and that I was in a past life regression session, remembering a past life in which I was basically a past life regression therapist. So that was something that sort of said, okay, maybe we can pick up with this skill and continue on in that lane. So from there, that's pretty much what I did. In 2006, I went down to Delhi and studied and qualified in past life regression and hypnotherapy with the California Hypnosis Institute of India with the late, great Dr. Sunny Satin and the wonderful Dr. Yogesh Chaudhry. So I practiced, my first 3 years was in India. So, taken in these beliefs and understandings about past life regression, and I worked with an exclusively Indian clientele for the first 3 years in Goa and Bangalore. So that made it pretty easy to be a past life regression therapist. And from there, I spent a few years or more in southern Thailand and some wellness resorts with medical spas, wonderful guests from all around the world, and some great fellow holistic therapists. So it's a peer-reviewed place. Very disciplined, and was able to do a lot of sessions with a lot of people in a great environment in a paradise location for a long time. So that was a really great, initiation or way to begin my career as doing sessions. So by 2012, I'd had enough of paradise and decided to move to Bangkok. So along the way, I went over to Florida and saw the excellent Dr. Will Horton and became a trainer with the National Guild of Hypnotherapists. I've been training since 2012. So part of that story, I guess, is I didn't really start out being particularly interested in past lives itself. I wasn't really choosing it, but I did feel in a sense that it chose me or reminded me that I have these past lives and life possibilities. So it's a bit of a calling. And I know it's a bit intense, but being a teacher and getting to this level of involvement for the last 15 years full-time every day is a pretty intense level of involvement. But what I find is that people who come for training or come for past life sessions, they've all got some degree of story where ultimately what it is a compelling motivation or a calling and that's really helpful. Some sense that your spirit guides are guiding you in some way to doing this, or that there is a compelling need, something to follow through with. And that helps people follow through with their sessions to the end, or follow through with their training and complete it and get it done.
And so that's what you look for in a potential student. It's almost like you're not talking to them as the conscious personality. You're looking for something from their higher self or their spirit guides that's getting them to do it.
Yeah, that's part of it. And their past lives as well. So, and it's there almost all the time anyway. So I've got a course on past lives for healers. And my assumption is that almost certainly anyone that comes for certification training has probably been a healer in a past life. Now, I'd be quite surprised if that was not the case. And they've normally had multiple, or either a healer or the spiritual path. And so for me, this whole story of how I got into the healer's path is now reflected in the healing methodology that I teach. And so for me, I work with past life regression as the centerpiece, but that's kind of a catch-all term because you can't take out hypnosis or hypnotherapy as prerequisite. So we need hypnosis to access the state. Therefore to remember forgotten memories, like of me being 10. But then we need hypnotherapy so that when people want to deal with past life things, they have to understand what's happening in this moment and what's happening in this life, so that when we do past life regression, it's therapeutic. So it talks to the key issue now, and we can see the repeating and patterns. So I had those patterns of, this is my crossroads. I knew that clearly. And then what are the 3 lives that talk to it? So if we don't clearly know what's happening in this life, which often we might think we do, but we often don't unless we explore it. And then our past life regression can go, rather than just regressing and remembering I was here and getting a little bit of a story, some pictures, then it can become a therapeutic journey that can really help us make key decisions at key points in our life. And another key is, so they're the prerequisites. But if you do enough past life regression, your past life regression can start getting a bit between lifey. And if you keep doing more, eventually it may get a bit spirit releasey. So there are hypnotherapists who may think past life regression's out there, but if any hypnotherapist does 1,000 sessions, sooner or later, it might get a bit past lifey. And it can be a bit the same with spirit releasement therapy. So if you do 1,000 past life regressions, you may find that some spirit releasey stuff can come up spontaneously, as it did in my life story.
So what is spirit releasement therapy?
It's difficult to separate out from past life regression, so we're still using regression as a key. So essentially, it's something that was developed in the last 100 years by a small series of psychiatrists, and it takes a largely secular and therapeutic approach. And we have some precise terms that we use to define the issue to distinguish it. but it's really connected to hypnotherapy and past life regression, which are kind of prerequisites before we even really get into spirit releasement therapy, because there are a lot of issues that you can actually resolve where you may not be aware of them, but by doing past life regression, you end up resolving indirectly some spirit releasement type issues. So you may never really notice that. And then there are ways that you can deal with it directly. So maybe if it's okay, if I can give a bit of a build up into how past life regression works, and then I can relate those principles, because that's people identify with that more easily, then I can relate some of those principles to how spirit releasement therapy can work. Okay, so my basic approach with past life regression is that we're regressing back to causative actions, and that can be in this life and a past life. And whether I'm doing spirit releasement therapy or past life regression, I tend to have a 3-session structure with a beginning, middle, and end. So whenever we're doing it, we want to reconnect with past skills or abilities that we've got that we may have forgotten about. And we want to, in a second session, get a full narrative of any problems that we may have and get a real detail of that story and to connect with some of the key emotions, and not to jump too early into healing. So I tend to have a third session so that we can do a full and final therapeutic resolution, but we have space to really gather a lot of the story. So, and I find in that part of the key to the resolutions of anything is that the insights alone can heal. So in past life regression, sometimes just knowing the story, those insights can release a lot of things, and we can formally break the bonds of time to release some of those outdated residues. But a big part of it is just the frame that we bring to the process that we're doing in the first place. And for me, past life regression is one big reframe. So anytime anyone comes in with the frame that I'm a person, I'm in this life, I've had a bad experience, and there are other people who are the cause, we ultimately end up reframing that and having a felt experience that rather than my being only my personality, I'm a spiritual being, rather than a series of bad experiences, we end up to be able to re-see them as spiritually helpful learning experiences, and with soul group members who are ultimately are helpful. So we may see them as enemies, but they're really part of a process where we're able to put into practice forgiveness, compassion, and sometimes even those things that we start off with the frame that they're an enemy, but we can see in the end that, and we may think that our soulmates are the people that love and care for us and help us, and our enemies are the ones that are unspiritual and really unhelpful. But towards the end of the third session, people can often realize that the enemies are also soulmates, and we can be supported in our spiritual journey, but sometimes even our enemies can be a blessing in disguise that gives us the kick to awaken. And this is something that, I can say, it sounds nice, but this is something our clients will often tell us. So I can give an example that can illustrate this. It's one thing as we read these books, and I also in my courses tell case studies that illustrate these things. I'll do that now, but I will say this one that I'm going to give comes from a video course that I've got on my website called Past Life Regression Demonstrated. So there I show the entire process right from the beginning. So that's a client who has never done hypnosis before, doesn't know if past lives are real or not, and sends in an inquiry email. And then we have an intake form and do some interviews. And then I record our first session, our second session, and going through all this process. So that's a nice thing where you can sort of see, is this real? How does it work? What's the technical part? So for people that are interested in seeing sort of behind the scenes, it's a nice thing. And then the story that arises from that is that this example, Maggie is a psychologist and academic living in Japan. She's originally from Mongolia. And even though she was brought up in a Buddhist-ish culture, she still had this lack of confidence as her presenting issue in being a healer, despite the fact that she's got a lot of competence and qualifications as a psychologist, partly because of the confidence to practice this non-scientific modality. She wasn't quite sure. And she'd also been trying to experience past life through some of my audio sessions. And she'd had some big breakthroughs and remembered a lot of things from this life. But anytime she tried to remember a past life, she said she would blank out for 10 or 15 minutes, come back, listen to the instructions, and then blank out again. So she couldn't access any past life information through the tapes alone. But she did get this life realizations. And she said her issue was, I freeze in the face of challenging and hard to face doing spiritual healing. And in her this life regression, she recalled being slapped in the face by her grandmother when she tried to use her early healing intuition. So, if we jump to so that's an important thing. If we just jump to the past life, we would have missed that. But even her language, freezing in the face of it's hard to face and literally being slapped in the face. So we could think, well, there's a good reason why somebody would be reluctant to be an intuitive healer if you're literally getting slapped in the face when you're 8 years old. But that also reminded her that she had skills at 8 years old, but then they were being repressed. So that was her key issue. And she also mentioned by the by that she has joint pains, especially in her knees. Now, people often do bring up sort of physical things as a primary cause for doing past life regression. And I tend to try to shunt that down the list. So let's have that as sort of a secondary benefit if it pops up, and leave it there. So when we did go into a past life, we went back into Asia about 80 years ago, and she was walking up to a monastery delivering a message. She ended up joining that monastery and staying there for a few years, but at this point, the information was stalling almost to the point of blocking just in the interview. So I had to use and demonstrate a number of techniques on how to get some things flowing. So this is quite useful because if people are wanting to practice past life regression in the early days, there are a few technical tricks that we can use. But there's also a key thing, which is, as that happened, I restated her intention to heal and get her buy-in, that now was the time to go into this, to have courage to go into a deep wound, to get a deep healing. Allow yourself to go into the darkness so we can shine a light on it. So with these words of encouragement, her breathing pattern changed. And she said, I'm getting this anxiety. I'm feeling really anxious. And a significant time started coming up. And she realized she was now a Tibetan monk in Tibet. We know from that time frame a lot of tricky things happened there. And she was acting as a teacher to her other Tibetan monks. So she's feeling quite anxious and scared. And so what I did there is I encouraged her and reassured her to go into that light so we can into that darkness so we can shine the light. I didn't need to stir up the event, but certainly allow her to sit with and witness it. And so as that went along, the anxiety changed and it turned into horror. She let out a pretty harrowing cry and weeping, a sadness, as she realized that her students were being attacked and being killed. This is on video, and you can sort of feel the change in the energy in the room and see as she's gasping and breathing heavily and sobbing and having these overwhelming feelings of emotion and loss for her students. And so as we allow those emotions to progress and to unfold, I asked her, is there a key phrase or words that can capture the meaning or the events here? And a key phrase was, I can't save them. So this kind of event that we get to is relatively common in past life regression. And so for us as a therapist, we need to stay calm, clear, and at peace as it's happening, and also to be comfortable enough to sit and allow this progression of emotion, knowing that it will change, knowing that it's not permanent, and just keeping playing it forward. And one way of communicating that to her, as I said at this time, remember, you are here to get this message. This is an emotional breakthrough from a past life event that's at the core of what we've been looking for. So before, this is disappointing, I can't find anything, I'm blocked. This is terrifying. So we can be grateful for those emotions arising, and now we can look for clarity on its cause. So we don't want to now jump in and apply comfort or even real therapy at this stage. We want to keep going and get the full message. So I said, there's a beautiful metaphor in here. Remember, the story started with her delivering a message to the monastery. But this experience is the message. This emotional connection is the thing that makes the story a felt transformative moment. And there's a cathartic release and some insights that heal. So for me, getting to these moments is often the key to past life regression therapy. Then we go beyond regression and a picture and a story, but we get a real movie that's really moving. And we can get the 3 acts with some director's commentary. So the third act of that life was we played it forward and she managed to escape. But she was obviously traumatized by all this. In order to deal with, she ended up sitting in meditation for many, many days. And she recalled in her regression that she realized that in that life, I'd been a monk and I was teaching wisdom and compassion, forgiveness and loving kindness and impermanence. But now she felt this pain, and it could turn into a hatred, revenge, bitterness, pointlessness, depression. She realized her key teaching was impermanence, and this experience was a key lesson in impermanence. She also recalled that she sat so long figuring this out that she just had tremendous pain in her knees, and she felt that this was a cause of her current life knee issues, and subsequently in the weeks and months following, her knees and joint issues improved significantly. So she was able to go beyond this trauma of seeing things as good or bad and ultimately being a helpful teaching lesson. So she could then sort of instantly forgive those that had killed her students, and she said they were just playing a role. So she went beyond a subjective dualistic perspective, and she could see it as just karma unfolding. So towards the end of that life, and I always like to take people to their death experience in a past life, she did go to live in another monastery. She got new students who she taught and who appreciated her. She kept teaching impermanence and love and compassion. And in her past life death, she left the body peacefully. And as she did, she started crying again. And with tears of joy says, I'm seeing my old students in the light. There's a loving energy. I said, well, is there a phrase that catches up the feelings or meaning of this? They said, you passed your test. So in the second session, we had tears of pain and regret, and I can't save them. In the third session, we had tears of joy with you passed your test. So in the video, you can see Maggie's tear-stained, smiling face trying to integrate all this. It's beyond words, but she'd found this piece of herself and been able to forgive her enemies and feel better for the trauma. And that becomes a peace that passes understanding. So for me, a lot of this was made possible by the fact that we didn't see an anxiety about what's coming up and then try and heal that. We just let it flow into some pretty dark and deep material. But because of that, we got into some really light, beautiful, wise things as well.
This is a remarkable story in a way, but also it's kind of typical of past life regressions and how they can be therapeutic when you use the right techniques.
Yeah, I think the key is, and there were a lot of barriers along the way. So it was kind of a story that wasn't getting anywhere. And I did have to give her a little encouragement to allow herself to experience things. And so I remember right at the beginning, when I first met her, she said, I can't access past lives. I doubt if they're really real. Maybe they're unscientific. I've tried to access them and I just can't get them. And so relating it back to her this life issues, she now felt a lot more comfortable, like, I'm a psychologist, I'm a scientist, how can I do this non-scientific stuff? Well, I've had an entire lifetime as a spiritual teacher in a good tradition, so she felt a lot more confident about offering spiritual regression type therapies. And she's now doing past life regressions herself and envisaging herself being a teacher again in this way. So it is, you're right, it's as a therapy, we get that cathartic release, and we connect it to this life, and it can be a significant turning point. And then another key thing that can happen is, and we've really got as much as we can out of the past life for this time. Because if we sort of cut it off, if we get cut off, we could have got cut off at any point. But through a number of the techniques, we're able to get so much of it out that it is then kind of like pulling out a lot of obscuring layers. And once you do that, with so much resolution at a past life level, you may find that you even invite them to scan through and put bright light into any areas that require healing, any last residues. So, for example, the knees. But as you scan through the body, you might find that now you've resolved so much of that past life stuff that now there's a clarity. But in that clearness, you may find that some spirit releasement type things are now able to pop through and be next on the list because the other one was completed.
How does this relate to spirit releasement therapy? And do you just give spirit releasement therapy to anybody that contacts you and says, hey, I want this, and you say, hey, okay, I'll book a session?
Right. I don't do that. So if someone says, I'm interested in spirit releasement therapy, I would still work with it in the context of all the spiritual regression therapies. So it's a good point. And so I'll come back to it because, like, how does this past life story relate to spirit releasement one? When I teach people past life regression, the real reason they don't get these really significant complete breakthroughs is because they sort of get stuck at the early gathering phase and don't know how to break through that, or they get stuck when the emotion starts to come up and they try to heal it a little bit and cut off all of the things that could have followed. So when the pain comes up, people are very quick to jump in and try to heal the very first pain that comes up. But my view is that if we can sit with it and keep asking questions and keep watching its layers and nuances, it's a bit like a surgeon. If we just cut the skin and then see there's a wound and then heal it, well, that's one thing. But if we cut the skin and then we cut through the muscle and then we get to the bone and then we say, hand me the saw, and we just keep going and going until we get to the heart of the issue. Now, I'm a bit squeamish when it comes to blood, so I don't want to do surgery, but I'm not squeamish when it comes to emotion. So just as she taught us, it's all impermanent. So we don't have to fight it or get rid of it or avoid it or run from these emotions. We can just sit with them and be curious and get all the information, and then we can get a real full resolution. And the connection with spirit releasement therapy is that a lot of people find or feel they've got an entity attachment, and they immediately rush to demand that it releases. So there can be a tendency to rush in to, which is what gets them into a spirit releasement issue in the first place. And then there can be a desire to rush out of it. And so as a therapist, I don't buy into that rush. And I'd say, let's wind it back and gather a lot of information and go through a complete process. And that will often involve regressing to the causes of the attachment and getting the full narrative story, just like we did in past life regression.
What are the spirits that would be attached? Because I see you talk about earthbound spirits, dark force entities, and ETs.
Yeah. I tend to focus, most of it is earthbound spirits and dark force entities. ETs come up a bit, but I will start on the first two. So earthbound, and by the way, this is a good distinction. It's a great question, because when we talk about spirit, I mean, what do we mean? And we have when we do regression, we have spirit guides. But when I'm talking about spirit releasement, I'm talking very specifically about these types of spirits and really none others. So I'm talking about earthbound spirits, and they used to have a human body and they have not passed into the light. So they remain bound to the earth plane. In hypnosis, we can connect with them, communicate with them, and discover who they were in a past life and why they attached. And the second one is dark force entities. So they're different in that they never had a human body, and they see themselves as being servants of a dark master who puts them to work, negatively affecting living people. We can also communicate with them, and there is a lot of deception and negativity associated with them, but they are also victims of that deception. They've been deceived as well. So we can help bring some clarity and some a new frame and some light that can assist them. So, and you ask, when people ring up and say, I want you to do spirit releasement therapy for me, we have to be pretty careful and just conscious of the role of suggestion. So anytime someone does that, they basically self-diagnose themselves as, I have SRT issues. And just because I'm an SRT therapist does not mean that I'll necessarily agree or say, okay, let's do that. I won't make the assumption that their presenting issue is actually the case. So I'll go through a process to find out, and there are many things that it could be to assess if it actually is a spirit releasement issue or not. So there are two actually ways that you can end up having to deal with spirit releasement. So what you're talking about there is intentional spirit releasement. So where people come to you and they bring it as their main presenting issue. And maybe that's half of it, but the other half is sort of unintentional and spontaneous spirit releasement therapy. So you can be working on any other issue in hypnotherapy or past life regression, and maybe you clean things out, or maybe there's something that will come up, and then you'll start communicating with them and realizing there's another modality we need to apply here, and you'll then start using some of the spirit releasement. But it's quite interesting because the client themselves may have no concept of what spirit releasement is. They're not asking for it. They don't know what it is. They haven't read the book. But when you start asking these qualifying questions to see if it's appropriate, they tend to give the same kind of answers.
With earthbound spirits, you say that they're people who used to be humans and they died and their spirit is earthbound, but they're not necessarily negative or like dark force entities. They're people who are just lost. Is that right? Can
be, yeah. And actually, I should make one distinction first, which is that, in past life regression, so this may sound a bit strange in entities, but we do speak with one certain level of spiritual being just routinely in past life regression, which is the client's spirit guide. And so we'll habitually ask them questions, get information, and that's kind of normal in the past life regression world. And spirit releasement is really much the same kind of process. But instead of talking to the spirit guide, we're talking to an earthbound spirit. So it's a bit of a different form of spiritual energy, but we can engage in much the same way. So now sometimes people have a spirit guide, but then there are guiding spirits. So what can happen is that there can be various levels, and people can use things like Ouija boards, mediumship, seances, evocation of spirits. Sometimes people in this life or a past life do white or black magic, Wicca, witchcraft, all these kind of practices in this life or past lives it can be. So essentially what happens is that people are kind of writing a blank check to the universe and become a little bit too open, and maybe unskillfully, unknowingly, even unintentionally can invite any and all spirits. And some of them can appear to be wise for a while, but can eventually create some kind of problems. So that's one case. But another case is that we're talking about spirit releasement. And so that assumes that the spirit is attached. So sometimes people might have an intention to call and connect with the earthbound spirit, this ones that passed on. One of the reasons is, do they get lost or confused? Sometimes they want to stay and stick around. And they may actually be asked by the person, can you stay with me? I don't want you to leave. You've died. I want you to stay with me. And the earthbound spirit may reply to that invitation and stick around. But there's a key distinction to be made, which is some kind of spirit communication is quite normal and it doesn't come into spirit releasement therapy. And that's when, if you have a loved one who passes away and within a period of a few weeks afterwards, you get a communication from them in the form of a dream or a hypnotic state or something like that, where they give you reassurance, a brief message, saying goodbye, that kind of thing's fine and quite normal. And it's not a spirit attachment, and they are not an earthbound spirit, and it doesn't require releasement or therapy. So it only really tends to become an earthbound spirit after it's been more than a few weeks or a month or two. So that's sort of quite a qualification to make. And if you're in a hypnotic state and you are talking with something that may have passed months or years or decades ago, we can't assume that it is an earthbound spirit. So there are qualifying questions. It can be a fragment of consciousness, can be a past life personality. I've had instances where it's like a soul group member, and they actually did cross into the light, but they leave a small portion of their energy to occasionally watch or guide the client with no negative consequences. But there still may be some earthbound spirits who are mixed in there.
And with ETs, what happens there? That must be an entirely different type of releasement, is it?
It's actually pretty similar in some ways. So maybe I'll start on the EBs, because what tends to happen actually is that, you do all your past life regression, and then earthbound spirits will probably be the next in line, and DFEs will be behind them. And if you clear all that out, you might find some ETs. Tends to be how it goes. So just like the process with EBs is that if they pass away, earthbound spirits, they can often just get confused and not see or find the light. They may have had a mental breakdown or a drug overdose at the time of their death. sometimes they do see the light, but they don't want to go into it. If they die, they feel a lot of anger, guilt, unfinished business, and they can then cling on to a personal place and not want to go into the light. And sometimes they also still see the light, but they're repulsed by it. Because if they've got a lot of hate or even a fear of going to hell and being punished for some bad things they've done, that can all lead them to hang around. And so you can see, the simple, confused ones, you can release them quite easily. And the ones that have, had a difficult death, and they can require a little bit more to understand their situation and then to release. And the way that we do that is a bit different to ET. So ETs has got a protocol that I'll get to, but what we normally do first with the spirits is, I said right at the beginning, it's tempting to find an attachment and sort of tell it to release, which is kind of like finding the first painful emotion and telling it to go away, and then you just miss out on so much. So you can actually tell something to release, and it might even say that it has, but it can sneak back. So what we want to do is, when we're talking about earthbound spirits, well, what is that? That means that it's a spirit that used to have a body. So it has, we can do a regression to what it was in its life. And so we can regress our client. When did you pick up this earthbound spirit? I was doing these practices 5 years ago where I was inviting any and all spirits. And then we can recall that's when it attached to the client from their side. But what about the spirit? What's its side of the story? So you can then literally communicate, and you can do a regression on and with the spirit to how did you die? What was your means of birth? And a lot of times it's pretty simple. It can recall its time of death. Maybe it's feeling angry or confused or worried, and you can reassure it, and then it can make the decision to go into the light. And it can be a pretty simple and straightforward release, if you know what to do and can regress them. DFEs can sometimes also be pretty simple, but oftentimes require a bit more conversation. So one of the key things here is that we're not telling them what to do. We're not demanding they do what we want to do, or even presuming that they're bad and that this is a bad thing. We want to just keep gathering information and eventually come to a sort of more non-dualistic frame that ultimately this can be helpful. And we can guide them through some of the guidance and wisdom we give it to make their own decisions. And so if we tell it to release, it's much better if we can discuss with it and have it realize that it wants to release and make its own decision. And that tends to be, a lot more long lasting. And also, if we just demand one thing release, that one trick is that where there's one earthbound spirit, there are often many. So if we can teach one of them how and why to release, there tend to be a bunch in the back that are watching. And if they understand the process, then you can say to all of them, you can release them in big batches. So rather than, having them release one by one, that's sort of another key, because they understand the whole process, not because they were told individually what they have to do. And often they can avoid that.
So if you have a spirit attachment or an ET attachment, I suppose they're in the background and they're kind of trying to influence you in some way and push your life in some direction. And I would imagine earthbound spirits and dark force entities have different goals, and ETs would have different goals. Would that be right?
Yeah, pretty much. The earthbound spirits, oftentimes, the conversation you have with them is they think that they are helping your living client in some way. So the ultimate conclusion we get to is having them realize that the best thing for everybody, for them and for you, is for them to go into the light and to allow the client to move on with their life. And so that's something we can explain to them. And so they may be worried about what's going to happen in the light, or may not but oftentimes when you do just give a brief explanation, they understand pretty quickly what's going on. And there are layers of DFE. So there's sort of mild, moderate, and the more challenging, but most of them are mild or moderate. So with a bit of if you know some of the process to follow, it can be quite straightforward as well. But they can be, they're wanting to assist, or sometimes they are actually wanting to get some benefit. They feel that there's a benefit in the attachment that they have to them. And part of the way we can have them make a new decision is to realize that they think that there's a benefit, but it's normally not as beneficial as they think that it is. and the other choice that they have to go into the light is much more beneficial. And so you're able to sort of convince them of that in that way. But with ETs, the main thing that I find, and by the way, within all this, I'm still really following a pretty strict therapeutic process. So I will be doing hypnotherapy, past life regression, and following William J. Walden's techniques, which are excellent. And so I am therefore predisposed to releasement, and my clients are coming to me because there's a problem that they want a therapeutic resolution for. So there are a lot of things that ETs can be doing, but the ones that I see and work with are where it's not that the ET is attached. So that's a big difference. EBs and DFEs can be attached to our client's spiritual body. The ETs don't attach directly. They tend to attach a device. And those devices are not quite as much as benefiting or influencing. They're really more about observing and gathering data. And so one of the key things there is once you've noticed that there's an attachment, you can say that we've discovered your attachment, and that means that that's compromised the quality and cleanliness of the data that you're getting. So we recommend you release it, but we don't even have to say we recommend you release it. We ask our client first, did you ever give permission for this to be attached? Do you still give permission for this to be attached? And almost always they'll say, maybe I did in the past, but I don't anymore. I'd like it released. And the ETs that I've experienced, they tend to very quickly understand that it is appropriate to release, and they will pretty quickly and easily, and often will even do something helpful to help redress any of the negative karmic consequences they've got by having an attachment, because they often have good intentions and don't intend to create any negative side effects. When they realize that they tend to be quick to heal it, apologetic, and will actually give some recompense. So so that's the experience, the main part of the experience with ETs in this structure.
This sounds almost like a science fiction movie. Is it a thing where perhaps this is kind of like metaphorical or symbolic, or is it more of an actual astral device?
Or everything that we deal with could be metaphorical or symbolic in the greater sense of the ultimate reality, in terms of how much our conscious mind and timelessness and all those things. There may be very varying levels of what reality is, but certainly with the ETs, it often does feel a bit like that. And so one of the things with the device is I'll say, put me through to the person that's running this device, and then you'll talk with a medium level data gatherer. And if you have any trouble with them, you can say, patch me through to your commander. So it really does sound, it does sound very sort of Star Trek-y. But the funny thing about it is that the clients have never said anything about this. They haven't read the books. They don't know how it goes. But there's a series of questions that Baldwin laid out, and I just ask those questions, and you just get the same results every time. And that's sort of the staggering thing. And then and they all seem to respond in pretty much the same way. And in terms of how you process that in terms of your own beliefs or experiences. But as a therapist, my main thing is, do we get a therapeutic resolution, and are we able to have a conversation that makes sense? And just the fact that they so uniformly do these very strange things, but consistently, is just my observation or my experience.
I suppose it's a thing with past life regression as well as the spirit releasement. As a therapist, you're not going to past lives looking for evidence so that you could look up in historical records and say, we've actually found this person. You're just interested in the therapy, not the evidence.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, so as someone with my background and in Buddhism and Eastern culture, that's something for me, like those felt experiences where there's a part where even evidence, I think there's a real limitation on what the conscious mind's ever capable of accessing and understanding. And conscious minds, in a way, aren't vehicles that are designed to understand the universe. It's almost the exact opposite. They're vehicles to filter out so many aspects of reality so that we can focus in on our day-to-day stuff. So in terms of analyzing or understanding all of the details. I just don't think I've got the hardware to do it in some ways. Or if you do ever get close to feeling that you're figuring out some of these things, it becomes beyond the realm of words to express or describe. And so that's for the client. And you're right, as a therapist, my main concern is that they get at the end of the sessions a resolution and a peace that passes understanding. So I don't look for them to analytically understand what's happened. And I'm also just not the type that does research, although I have plenty of clients who go home and Google where they were and say, oh, this was the dress I visualized and here I was, or I was in my regression and I thought that's crazy. There's no way if I'm in that jungle, I should never be wearing those clothes. And then they go and Google, the Mayan headwear of the 1500s and go, that was it. So, but it's not something I ever do. But as long as I get the therapeutic resolution, I'm happy and on with the next.
So can you tell us about Past Life Awakening Institute, and if people wanted to study with you, how do they go about it?
I've got a website there. So the key thing is go to the website, the Past Life Awakening Institute. So I've got foundation courses there, which are low-price courses that tell you about the therapies and how they work. And then I've got premium courses that's certification training, which we do video call mentoring. And if you're a healer that has an existing client base and some of these, and you want to work on those, you can submit case studies right up and tell me what you're doing. And I can preview and prepare you for the sessions. We can review the sessions that you do, and we can do a lot of that, through Zoom video calls in person, and take you through some of those, just how to really practically implement the curriculum. And actually, one other thing is I've got a YouTube channel which people can check out, which is the Past Life Awakening Institute. So in that, I noticed, particularly with spirit releasement, it's a little difficult to communicate some of the things that are going on, and even to speak in the public domain about some of the aspects, because there can be a tendency to misdiagnose themselves as having an issue. And I really don't diagnose and have to be quite convinced and through direct experience that we really are facing a spirit releasement issue. Now, some people, I describe some unusual spiritual experiences, for me. But one thing a lot of people say to me is, I've had all these really crazy experiences. Even though you're a past life therapist, you'll never be able to understand them. And I've heard that 100 times, but I've never heard a story that I couldn't understand. So try me if you're interested in personal sessions as well. But one last thing is, often with spirit releasement therapy, a key thing is people come in with preconceptions, and often these come from movies. So movies like The Sixth Sense can be pretty helpful. Movies like The Others can be kind of scary. And even The Exorcist is just a big one. So I've got a 40-minute film review that goes into the fact and the fiction behind that. So a key thing is, if you dismiss something like that and think it's all just fiction, and then you have an experience in your session and you go, oh, I thought that was fiction, it's actually fact. But the problem is now I don't know what to believe. Does that mean that it's all fact? And there is certainly, I go in and cut out, some of this can happen, some of this definitely will not. So I've got some reviews there. So if people are interested as well, they can, that's a nice relatable case study. So they can check out my YouTube channel or my website, Past Life Awakening Institute.
Fantastic. Well, thanks a lot for coming onto the podcast. It's great to talk to you, and you got so much information that helped me so much as well with my studies. And if anybody does want to book a session with you, I do recommend it. And perhaps we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, sounds good. Love to. Yeah, always good to talk to you, Simon. Thanks very much.
And that was an interview with Mark Beale. And if you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via your favourite podcast app to make sure that you don't miss out on any episodes. And thanks for listening.